Hello, everyone. My name is Philip Reichel. I'm emeritus professor at the University of Northern Colorado, and I'm an adjunct professor at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. So although I'm retired, I'm still staying active in some online teaching. I've got a few textbooks and some other articles that I'm staying active in as well. So I am more semi-retired than I am retired. My PhD is in sociology from from Kansas State University. I began my teaching career back in 1972, and I moved to Georgia for the first time ever being in the South. My dad was in the Air Force, so I grew up as an Air Force dependent and got moved around quite a bit, but never into the South. And so when I got to my first teaching assignment, which was at Augusta College, now Augusta University in Augusta, Georgia, I found myself teaching classes that I had never taken as a student because criminal justice in the early 1970s was just getting started as a separate discipline. And courses like Introduction to Policing and History of Police and other kind of things were really, really brand new in the 1970s. So I was trying to orient myself to a brand new place and a brand new subject matter. And I thought one of the ways that I could do that would be to introduce my students to the history of policing in their region. And it became quickly apparent to me that there was no history of policing in the South. Pretty much all the histories of policing concentrated on the urban North, with Boston and New York City being particularly highlighted. And so I started searching, saying, well, what can I do that might make these lectures more relevant to my Georgia students than them simply hearing about what was happening up north. And so that took me into this brand new area for me, and actually it continues to be a brand new area for many, of what are referred to as Southern slave patrols. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about in one of the articles that I did. 1988, I wrote my first article on that topic. It was followed actually by another article in 1992. And those two articles together are the ones that John's going to be helping me walk through today. I have kind of mixed feelings about my work from 30 years ago coming back into the media. This is not the first time in the last 2 years that I've been contacted by either academicians or media personnel to ask about this. It's nice to have the recognition of work that one did early on in their career. It's disappointing for the reasons that the interest has been rekindled. So that's where my mixed feelings come in. But I'm happy to talk about it. I will point out, as I've mentioned to John already, this is work from 30 years ago, and I didn't continue working in this area. So I may have to use I'll get back to you on that a couple times to remind yourself, or to maybe ask John's assistance in going through some of these things. My work since the 1990s focused more on comparative criminal justice issues. And so I was concerned or interested in how police, courts, and corrections operate in countries around the world, using the United States oftentimes as a comparison. And there might be the opportunity to do some of that as the discussion here goes on. So what I wanted to do today is just give you a little bit of an overview of the article that was in the pack of readings. And basically what I was interested in doing, as I said, was to take the history of policing out of the urban North and take a look at how it developed in rural areas and the South, since that's where I was living at the time. It was obvious, of course, that policing had to be developing other places than just in Boston and Philadelphia and New York City. But you couldn't tell that from any of the textbooks at the time or any of the other places that people were getting information. And so I had two problems that I was kind of confronting to begin with. First of all, what constitutes modern policing? That is, how do you define when a police department has become modern? And secondly, what stages are gone through to get to that point of being modern? There were a couple individuals, especially in sociology and political science disciplines, that were looking at stages and included the word transitional stage in some of their writings. And that intrigued me. And so I was thinking, well, we know about informal policing, especially what was occurring again in Boston and New York City. And those were examples that you've heard about as well. The night watch, the 11 o'clock and all is well kind of people, and the local constables, which was, people don't always know, initially a volunteer position. And those were the things that we think about as informal policing, because most everywhere, social control of community members started with the community members themselves being involved in that control mechanisms. And so what happened to take us from those informal mechanisms to the more formal mechanisms? Everyone pretty much knew it didn't happen overnight. You didn't go from a night watchman to a uniformed New York City Police Department. So what were those stages in between? And that was what was kind of intriguing me. And the more I read about the Southern slave patrols, the more I started viewing those as examples of this transitional stage in policing that others had mentioned, but really hadn't really talked about or given many examples of. And so I thought that this was a good way to approach the topic for my students. Again, I'm thinking primarily about just lectures to students living in Georgia in the 1970s and just trying to come up with ways to engage them and to think about them. If I were to start all over again today, obviously with incidences in the last couple of years, I would be approaching both the lecture and the articles in a different kind of fashion. But anyway, the arguments to that point in terms of transition were pretty much blaming urbanization and industrialization on the reasons for moving from an informal policing to a modern policing. And linked to urbanization and industrialization, we had suggestions of population increases, mass migration and immigration, public riots that were occurring in different cities, increasing crime as cities grew in size. And those were all, I believe, are correctly so, good explanations to explain the growth of policing, especially in urban areas. But I was still wondering about, well, we had police developing in the rural areas and in the South as well. And those didn't have urbanization and industrialization concerns to the same manner or the same level that others did. And especially these things that were still unusual to me, Southern slave patrols were specifically occurring in the rural areas. So that goes completely against what all the other developments were saying regarding how policing got started. So I started looking at the Southern slave patrols as well in two ways, I guess. One, as a transition toward modern policing, but also with a curiosity as to how did they come about anyway? What were they? And so I guess what we'd like to maybe talk about a little bit and what you were reading about as well was more of the how did they constitute, what did they do, how are they made up, and so on. But the intriguing area also for me, I think that has the overlapping into today, is the idea that they were developing as a response to a dangerous class, with the slaves being the dangerous class. And they were dangerous for particular reasons. As you read, and as you hopefully know also, the slaves were not docile, happy people living on the plantations. They didn't like it there, and they were trying many ways to disrupt their situation of slavery. And too often we forget about that, not only 30 years ago when I was writing this, but even today, we too often hear the astonishment, well, these slaves were fed, kept housed, how could they not be happy? I think in your readings, there was an item from one of the New Hampshire, maybe slave owners who said, without provocation, my slave has run away. Really? Without provocation, your slave has run away. So that was the attitude, not only then, but I think to some extent, even the attitude today about us not fully appreciating the history of slavery. And so why do you consider slaves dangerous class? Well, they ran away. That was dangerous, not only to the property owner, the slave owner, but also to others where the slave might run. The slaves committed criminal acts. They committed thievery. They committed acts of violence. They committed poisoning and attempted poisoning. In fact, some of the slave acts specifically were designed or included in the slave codes themselves. We need to take action against the recurrence of poisonings by slaves. Crop destruction. I mean, a variety of ways in which the slaves were showing their displeasure, but in doing so, presented themselves as being a danger to the slave owners specifically, but whites living in the South more generally. There were also revolts and uprisings, and those were quite scary. There were, the Stono River Revolt in 1739, right around there anyway, outside of Charleston, was particularly notable in terms of getting the attention of the public and formulating things like the slave codes. In addition to those three things, I think it's also important to remember that in many cases, the slaves were the majority in the population. So not only were they dangerous, but there were a lot of them. In South Carolina, for example, the slaves comprised more than 50% of the population from the 1720s into the 1760s. So you had more than 50% of the people living in South Carolina that were slaves. In some of the other slave states, the percentage of the population got up to a third or so. And I think maybe in Georgia, in a while there, or in a couple of years, there were 50%, 50-50 in Georgia as well. But the point more is not so much the percentage, but just that there were sheer numbers of these people who were committing these, in quotes, dangerous acts. And as a result, people said, we need to do something, much as was happening in the North when people said we need to do something about the public drunkenness, the riots, the immigrants coming in, these types of things. Let me stop there and see what kind of questions those points have raised and carry on the conversation.
I think that's a great overview, and thank you for that. I think one of the things that would be most interesting to kind of explore a little bit is what the slave patrol powers kind of developed, how they developed. So your articles specifically kind of do walk us through the, at first it was just kind of to see if anything was going on, if they were, plotting or, there were runaways, that kind of thing. But then, I was specifically thinking about this paragraph about, but despite the time, place, supervision, slave patrols generally had the power and authority to enter any plantation. And they just, it kind of became this, the powers grew over time. And maybe you could explain maybe how that.
Yeah, they definitely did. And I think that's a correct way to phrase it, that beginning stages were just kind of, where are they and what are they doing? If you have dangerous classes, you want to keep an eye on them. You want to find out, and that hasn't changed today at all. We still have technology that's keeping track on spies and spyware and all that kind of stuff. So anybody who is perceived to be a danger to the rest of us, we want to keep track of them. So I think that's exactly how it started. And you saw that by just giving the authority to the, let me just do a little transition here because I forgot to mention, although people read about it, these slave patrols are linked to militias, but they are separate from the militias. And I think that's important not only now, but maybe for some of our later discussions as well, because this wasn't happening in the North. The militias were in the South. They were throughout the colonies, but the militias in the South had to protect the colonists against pirates, against Indians, against just a variety of folks with the English, a variety of folks. And so the militias were somebody or some groups of volunteers for the most part, or it was expected volunteer. And the militias were the ones that had to provide their own arms. Many would argue that's where the Second Amendment is linked to militia, because if you didn't have the Second Amendment, then the individual citizens who were required to do militia duty wouldn't be able to have the weapons to carry out their duties. So now go back to the point you were making. So early on then, the slave patrols that were given specific duties of slave patrols were doing this in lieu of militia duties. So they weren't really, they were drawn from the militia, but they were doing special duties. And those special duties then were different than those that the rest of the general militia were doing. And they included things like riding around from plantation to plantation and just checking on people, questioning any slave, presumed slave. And I think later on, every slave state except Louisiana, you could presume that a Black person was a slave. In Louisiana, it was the reverse. You must presume that they were free unless they proved slave. But anyway, you see a Black person off the plantation, and you had the authority to stop and question him or her, what they're doing, where you're going. Do you have papers showing that you have to go to the store today? I mean, those kind of things. And so they had a great deal of authority, which another transition, interestingly, in the 1760s, 1770s, exactly what the colonists were rebelling against in England, saying, we don't like all of this, coming in and checking on us and seeing what we're doing. We have rights. We need to be able to protect these. And of course, this is what was happening to the slaves at the time. There were no rights to self-incrimination. There were no rights to invasion of privacy. There were no search and seizure laws, any of that kind of stuff. So the patrollers, as they were called, or patrollers sometimes as well, were given complete authority to go onto the grounds and check to see where people are and ask what they were doing. And then, as your question was going on, things started getting more formalized, as it were. The patrollers were given extra duties. They were required to spend more time on patrolling duties. I think also interestingly, the slave owners who were required to do patrol duties could also buy out of it. They could say, you know what, I think we need to have slave patrols, but I'm not sure I need to be dirtying myself with this kind of thing. So let me go hire somebody else to serve in my capacity as the patroller, which you can only imagine, what kind of people do you have available that would be interested in going out and performing this kind of a duty? And there are probably individuals who loved this and were quick to raise their hands saying, I'll volunteer to do that for you, which would present all kinds of new situations and problems. So the increasing responsibilities, eventually they were allowed to punish on their own authority. The slave patrollers I'm talking about were able to punish on their own authority individuals they found off plantations. That again presented problems because from the slave owner's property, you are destroying his or her tractor. This is my property. And if you punish my property too severely, then my property won't be able to do the work that I'm expecting them to be able to do. So there were some problems with the authorities given, or the authority given to the slave patrollers from the perspective of the slave owners occasionally as well. And then I think carrying this process on, I think eventually, I remember correctly, maybe in Georgia, the slave patrols were even allowed to start enforcing the laws against whites as well as blacks. And this, of course, gets us even closer to the idea of a formalized policing system with slave patrols as a precursor.
Yeah, that's exactly, that's excellent. I mean, one of the things that I think we should kind of preface is that some of this, is based in a system of, it's extending a system of white supremacy too, right? Because it's taking not only the slave owner, but it's also then extending the right to other whites to police. Where I'm going with this, kind of like, it's lifting them above the African-American captive.
And I think this links nicely back to the role of the militia again as well. Because to the extent that the militias were required in all colonies, and people were obliged, and I think actually, I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist, so I think they, both blacks and whites were obliged at times to behave or be part of the militia, except as far as I can remember, not in the slave patrols themselves. But this idea that the militia having a military type of authority and a very formal position within society, that had to have given some kind of a higher level of authority to these individuals when they were riding onto the plantation. It wasn't just your, local butcher, baker, and candlestick maker that were taking these obligations on themselves. Nor was it plantation owners going out and hiring private individuals to help them control the slaves. This was, as you point out, a very formal, official state or colonial sanctioned group, and that had to have given a certain amount of authority that certainly would not have been given to or perceived by either the slave owners or the citizens in general, and even the people serving slave patrol duties themselves. So yeah, that authority, I think, was certainly there.
Well, I think one of the things that I enjoyed about the article about urbanization was the fact that you kind of really explode this idea that, the South didn't have, what am I trying to say, any policing. Whereas, as you were saying earlier, the big cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, or whatever, have this formalized, there's disruption to the peace. And we don't think of that in the rural context, but your article really just kind of delves right in and says, well, that's not
quite right.
Not quite right.
Well, two things. Let me first of all mention that the cities in the South did still have constables, and I think Charleston, for example, had a night watch. So they had some of the similar things, but they weren't progressing. Those examples of informal policing didn't progress in the South to a full-fledged police force in the same manner they did in the North. In fact, even today, I think we all know and understand that when we're talking about police officers, we're typically talking about city police. When we're talking about county policing, we're more likely talking about sheriffs and so on, sheriff's deputies. That's not always true, and it's becoming less true as cities and counties combine and those kind of things. But for the point that I want to make, policing in the South became much more county-based, and it was developing at the county level in a different way than it was developing in the cities. And while everybody in the North probably knew the name of their police chief, but had no idea who was the head of their sheriff's department, the reverse was almost true in much of the South, that the county sheriff came to have a great deal of authority and prestige attached to I'll say his position, because there weren't really any her position, her sheriffs at the time. And I think that also has gone on to play a role, because as we look at, and I haven't looked into this, I don't know if anybody else has either, but how county sheriffing, rural policing developed differently from city policing, I think would be quite interesting to follow. And I suspect that the role of the slave patrols in developing policing in the South, probably you could argue had a bigger impact on the way counties developed and county policing than the way cities. Pure conjecture on my part. I've not looked into it, and I don't know if anybody else has either. But as I'm thinking about this and saying it out loud, it would be quite intriguing to see to the extent that that's true. Yeah. I'm sorry, I got us off on a tangent again.
Oh no, that's good. I think that's an important distinction to make with the the South versus the North policing, and even the because I knew it, but I hadn't ever heard it articulated quite like that. So the one thing that I think we could probably begin to close on is this, because before we were talking about kind of the bringing it a little bit closer to today, and maybe how the militarization of the police, the militia that you were talking about is of course different than what we were talking about today with the militarization. But I think on page 70 of the transitional police article, you have this 4-point breakdown of what the 4 interdependent propositions policing. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about those and how they related to the slave patrols.
So yes, the argument is basically that the colonies became more politically organized, and of course that certainly had an influence on how formal things would develop, because you do need to have a political structure in order to be able to have a government entity like a policing system or a fire department or any other kind of public utility. So that became an important factor. And in the South, this was being done within the context of something that already existed, the militia. I don't think that was quite as true in the North. And as a result of that, moving into the second point, the elites were able to convince others that this was necessary. And this goes back to our classic social control issue worldwide. It's typically the elites in a society that are threatened by the dangerous classes. And what you need to do is convince others who are not the non-elites, but not among the dangerous classes, that they are also threatened in some manner. And so you find this, again, using the North as an example, the idea of mass immigration and migration coming in. And this did cause some problems for the elites, especially. But then the elites would also explain to the non-elite, non-dangerous class folks that you are subject to these kind of concerns and problems as well. So it's to your advantage to support our request for more sophisticated social control mechanisms. And this is not old and it's not new. I mean, it's been around forever and it's probably not likely to change. So you have those in power seeing a need and seeking out support or convincing others that they have a similar kind of need for protection. And that certainly was happening here as well. The control of the slaves was necessary to solidify the elite position, kind of a continuation of that other argument. But slipping into the militia again and how policing might have developed differently in the South than it did in the North because of the existence of slave patrols. I think it was the 1992 article that I was making the argument. The Southern whites were used to having the militia do these kind of things, to be on slave patrols, and possibly importantly, based upon the items that you were just drawing my attention to, these slave patrols were acting against a specific class that even the whites who didn't own plantations and didn't own slaves could still see themselves as being placed in danger because of. And so it became maybe a little bit easier for the elites in the South to explain to the non-elite whites that we've got this mechanism in place. It's the militia and the slave patrols. You can see how helpful the slave patrols have already been in controlling the slave population, the dangerous class. And so what we would like to do now is do this more formally and develop a state or county funded policing department that will have broad-ranging powers to keep all of us safe from whatever kind of danger is presenting itself to ourselves and our property. And given the experiences of white Southerners specifically, of having had the slave patrols around, and again, pure conjecture, maybe a nodding saying, you know what, I think you've got a fair point. Let's develop some formal policing systems because we see what you're saying. We understand that there are dangerous people out there. We've seen the slave patrols helping to control these dangerous people. So policing in the South begins to be perceived a little bit differently in police departments than they do in the North. Even the idea of uniforms, we sometimes forget, or some people may never have known, that the initial police were not uniformed. The police in Boston and New York City didn't wear uniforms. They had badges, usually made of copper, not surprisingly. So you would you would show your copper badge and convince them that the person that you were trying to stop misbehaving, that you were a police officer. And the people who were hired to do this policing didn't want to wear uniforms. They saw that as a form of distinction that would set them apart from others. And it also led this idea of a militaristic, because you're in a uniform, and that was also very, very offensive to many early on. So we had, again, happening in the South, a different view of everything from the authority to be given to fellow citizens, to the idea of wearing a uniform, to the distinctions of setting yourself apart from others. All those things were happening a little bit differently in the South than they were in the North.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the argument you make in the 92 article about how it's this concept of diffusion, and how maybe it was South Carolina that kind of led the charge and spread the idea of, like, I also like the idea too that, like, in the North, when the police were introduced, people went, well, this sounds like despotism. This sounds like I don't want to be beholden to this group of people. Whereas in the South, there's already a group of people who are beholden, by law.
Yeah.
It made more sense to just kind of extend it out to the rest of society.
Yeah. Great way to phrase it.
Yeah. So it's incredibly interesting. And again, we don't, as you said, there's plenty more that could be done on this.
There is.
But I want to thank you for, I think that we could talk for hours, I think, on this topic, but I think this is a great place to leave it. And unless you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to just toss out there.
Well, I guess I would feel that I hadn't completed my job if I don't go on to mention that, again, given my last 30 years of interest in comparative criminal justice, there are a lot of things that U.S. policing can learn from other countries. And I don't think that we always appreciate that. And regardless of how any country or city got to the point that it has its own police force, which they do now, there's always room for improvement. And there are some things that we can learn from not only others within our own country, but I would encourage all of us to look outside of the country as well and see how Europe and Asia especially, and Oceania, less so Africa, because of all the colonization in Africa, we pretty much end up getting what they had forced upon them. But yeah, look out as we're looking for things to improve our own situation and to respond to problems at home. Not all solutions are to be found at home.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think that's, as we move forward with the debate about policing, the wider we cast our net, the better we'll probably catch the better ideas.
Yeah,
so,
I agree.
All right. Well, thank you again for your time and your articles. They were amazing and incredibly helpful to.
My pleasure.
Even 30 years in the future.
I know. We'll have to do. And again, it's sad that they are coming back to the forefront, but it's also gratifying that something that you did, as I say, early in your career has stuck around and people still find it to be of interest. So that doesn't always happen.